Good evening and welcome to Sunday Night Live. We have a good crowd tonight, and I hope it's because of the preaching and not because of the smells coming from the kitchen. But I wouldn't bet on that. We are continuing our study tonight of biography as we look at the lives of individuals throughout the Old and New Testament that perhaps don't get a lot of attention in our regular Bible study because in some ways they're often obscure. Well, tonight we're going to look at the life of a New Testament character we find in Acts chapter 18 by the name of Apollos. Now, Apollos is not one of the apostles, and he is not a man who spent time with Jesus while he was on this earth and in his ministry, but Apollos is recognized in the New Testament as one of the great preachers and evangelists recorded in the pages of the Bible. And he's particularly meaningful to me as a localized church evangelist because that's much of what Apollos did and the role that he performed. And so I want us to turn and just learn a few things from his life in the few brief moments we have together. Starting in Acts chapter 18 and verse 24. It says, "Now there was a certain Jew named Apollos, born at Alexandria, an eloquent man and mighty in the Scriptures, who came to Ephesus." An eloquent man, mighty in the Scriptures. He was a Jew born in Alexandria, so apart and away from Jerusalem. Yet he was a believer in Jesus. Now it's going to tell us he knew only the baptism of John, so we know that he'd heard the story. He must have believed certainly that Jesus was the Messiah who had come and that he was resurrected from the dead. So with what limited knowledge he knew of Christ, he was preaching and boldly proclaiming, and the Bible uses the word eloquent of his speech, so he was obviously a very effective communicator. And so as Apollos, that tells us kind of who he is and what he's devoted his life to. And I think as we look in not only in the book of Acts, but in a few other places where he's mentioned, we learn some things about his character that we can look to and model in our lives as well. First of all, here in verses 24 through 26, it tells us as it continues, "This man had been instructed in the way of the Lord, and being fervent in spirit, he spoke and taught accurately the things of the Lord, though he knew only the baptism of John. So he began to speak boldly in the synagogue." So here he is, he's been converted to the idea of Jesus, taught about Jesus. He doesn't know the full picture yet, but what he does know, he has a burning desire to share. He's got a fervent spirit, the word tells us. Now I love that zeal and that passion, that desire within him. I've seen that in many instances where Christians come out of the water and they are absolutely on fire and they don't know very much, but what they know, they're eager to share. And I think in that, we learn something about his character, this fervor he has for the gospel and wanting to share the good news of Jesus with others from the very first day that he learns about it. He was so excited about Christ that he longed to share the message with other people. And if we stop and realize exactly what Christ has done for us, that's an example that every believer should follow and never grow cold in that zeal. And I'll tell you, that's easy to do. And it doesn't matter if you serve as a shepherd in the church, or if you serve as a deacon in the church, or you've been a member for 50 years, or even if you're a preacher. There are times where we become less zealous, less on fire, less fervent about sharing the message. I remember as we were driving through, when one of our children was little, our daughter Reagan, we're driving through a drive-through, I think it was at McDonald's, and we had started a program at Sherrod Avenue where we had these little cards that had on the front just an invitation to church, and on the back they had the instructions for CPR, like the little cartoon instructions. And we did that so maybe people wouldn't take it and throw it away. You know, maybe they'd keep it and put it in their wallet, laminated it. And as we'd go through, and I'd been talking about that morning at church, about giving these out to people when you leave your tip. Now, the problem with that is you got to leave a good tip. Interestingly enough, my cousin was a waitress, and she said the worst day for tips for a waitress, guess what day it is? That's really sad, isn't it? That's really sad. So step it up, because you're an ambassador of Jesus. Okay? But you'd leave it with their tip. We'd encourage people to go to the grocery store and hand them out to people if they were in line with them, whatever. And so we were going through McDonald's, and I remember this 7, 8-year-old little girl was saying from the back as I'm pulling away, "Daddy, you didn't give the lady the card." And I said, "Well, honey, we're already..." "Daddy, you didn't give the lady the card." So I had to put the car in reverse. I did make sure there was nobody behind me in line. Go back and say, "Excuse me, ma'am, thank you for your good service today. Here's the card." But what fervor. And isn't that what we should model in our lives? And never lose that zeal. How many times do we see that people have that zeal for a little while, and then we just kind of get stuck in the rut or the routine of our Christianity? Christianity, being a soldier of the cross, being an ambassador of the King, should never just be a routine. Should never just be a routine. Consider Paul's words in 1 Corinthians 9 as we examine his heartfelt plea in verses 16 through 18. He says, "For if I preach the gospel, I have nothing to boast of. For necessity is laid upon me. Yes, woe is me if I preach not the gospel. For if I do it willingly, I have a reward. If against my will, I have been entrusted with a stewardship. What is my reward then? That when I preach the gospel, I may present the gospel of Christ without charge, that I may not abuse my authority in the gospel." Now, I find that second verse, verse 17, extremely interesting. Because he says, if I do it of my own will, then I have a reward. But if I even do it and it's not of my own will, what could that possibly mean? That means that sometimes to get something that you know you should do to become a desire, you've got to see it as a duty. You see, part of the Christian faith is developing our desires even when they start off as our duties. And the ultimate objective is for our duties to become our desires. Isn't that right? You know, sometimes it's hard. I've told you this before. When I first went off to college at Oklahoma Christian all those years ago, I just really couldn't, I hate to admit this, but I really couldn't wait to not have to go on Sunday night and Wednesday night anymore. Because I would go and I knew that you didn't have to do that in the Bible. There's nowhere in the Bible that talks about Sunday night and Wednesday night. You know, and I remember sitting through, and I guess my daddy's sermons were more boring on Sunday night or something. I don't know. But I remember going off to college, and it wasn't a month in. I was still back every Sunday night and every Wednesday night, because that duty, as I had that drug problem as a kid when my parents drugged me to church and drugged me to potluck and drugged me to Saturday morning prayer breakfast and drugged me. I mean, as I was drugged to everything, that duty, and that's what it was, had without even consciously become a part of my life, become a desire. So here's the thing. That old adage, fake it till you make it, that applies in every area of life. Just because you don't want to do. I mean, we live in a world where people think they should only do what they want to do. Yeah, good luck on that making anything successful in your life. Because almost everything in my life that resulted in good things, there was a point where I didn't want to do it. How about you? I remember seeing a TED Talk where a lady was talking about the 5-second rule. That if you're faced with something you need to do, if it's something as simple as flossing your teeth in the morning, or something as major as a project you've got to get done, you always have that moment where you don't want to do it. This is what you do. In the first 5 seconds, you say, I'm never going to want to. And you do it anyway. Because the thing is if you procrastinate it, if you put it off, guess when you'll want to? Well, I'll do this later. When you want to, you don't want to now, so you're not doing it. Guess when you're going to want to? Never. So you do those things, and when you think about, I don't want to do this, that's when you develop the habit, the duty, the trigger. You do it anyway. And when it comes to having the fervor, you're not always going to feel on fire. You're not always going to feel like in that conversation with your neighbor bringing up an invitation to church. You're never always going to feel like if you're a keeper searching out those visitors on Sunday morning. Some Sundays you're going to be in a hurry. Some Sundays your mind's just not going to be into it. You're not always going to feel like it. Do it anyway. Because fervor is not just always feeling like it. Fervor is dedication to what we know is our responsibility. Whether you're a bringer, a teacher, or a keeper. Apollos gives us an example of what it means to be fervent in his faith. And it tells us here, he was bold in his proclamation. Look at verse 28. And he vigorously refuted the Jews publicly, showing from the scriptures that Jesus is the Christ. He was fearless, always ready to give an account. He would have, although he didn't fully understand the gospel message, Paul's words in Romans 1:16, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ. It is the power of God unto the salvation of all who believes." Apollos would have echoed that sentiment. He was fervent for the Lord. We look in Acts chapter 18 here in verses 25 through verse 27, where it tells us, verse 26, that when Aquila and Priscilla heard him, they took him aside and they explained to him the way of God more accurately. And when he desired to cross to Achaia, the brethren wrote, exhorting the disciples to receive him. And when he arrived, he greatly helped those who believed through grace. Now here we learn that he's pulled aside and gently taught by Aquila and Priscilla, patiently taught. And what's his response? Now I'll tell you that I am impressed by this man's character and his sincerity. Because he is not a follower, he's a leader. He's not just a listener, he's been a teacher. And he's not just someone who is just engaging in teaching on some elementary level. He's an eloquent speaker who is used to people listening to him. Yet when he's pulled aside and taught the way more accurately, and in that conversation there always has to be the conflict. Let me tell you, we get into this friendship evangelism thing, and we have to be like Priscilla and Aquila and be gentle and be kind and be patient with people. But if you think that evangelism will ever happen without a moment of conflict, you're living in a fantasy world. Because repentance requires someone to acknowledge they're wrong. It requires that. So at some point, he had to have faced the reality that he was preaching a substandard message, a message that was missing something. And that he therefore in his own life, if he knew only the baptism of John, he had only been baptized with the baptism of John, and he had to now be born again in Christ Jesus. But how does he respond to that? It says that even though he was fervent for Christ and he was teaching and he was eloquent and all of the above, he was willing to change when he was faced with the truth and his own error. When taught the truth, he didn't resist. He submitted. We know that he submitted because they wrote him a recommendation to the brethren. And the text doesn't say that he specifically in written word that he responded to the gospel, but we know he did because in the very next passage, in chapter 19, it'll talk about some men there in Ephesus who had heard only the baptism of John, and it says they were all baptized. So they had perhaps been taught by Apollos. And they were following that same standard. But therefore, just as they were be baptized into Christ, so Apollos must have been as well. He's willing to submit to God's will, wholly and completely. Notice he didn't say, but the person who taught me, this is what they believed. And I can't imagine that they could be wrong. No, he listened to the truth and the word and was willing to submit. Now that's a spirit that we need to hope for and ask for in our friends and neighbors in this world. But it's a spirit that we must also exemplify. To search diligently the Scriptures and always conform our life, our doctrine, our faith, our belief, and our action to the will of the Lord above all other things. He was willing to correct the error in his life. Thirdly, we look in 1 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 12. We'll also look in chapter 3 and in chapter 16 of 1 Corinthians. And we learn that Apollos, once he was fully converted to Christ, he becomes a competent church leader. Chapter 1, verse 12 reads, "Now I say this to each of you. Some say, I am of Paul, or I am of Apollos, or I am of Cephas, or I am of Christ." And here Paul is dealing with the divisions within that church where they're denominating, separating themselves into little groups, hyphenated groups of Christianity. And Paul says, no, Christ is not divided. But what I want you to notice is he had such an influence on the Corinthian church that he's grouped together with a pretty noble band. I mean, some Christians were saying, I am a Paulite Christian, and that's the best kind of Christian you can be. Others were saying, oh, I'm a Cephasite Christian. I'm a Peterite Christian. That's the best kind of Christian you can be. Others, well, I'm a Christite Christian. But there was a group that esteemed Apollos so much that they said, I'm an Apollos Christian. And that's the best kind of Christian you can be. That tells us something about who he was as a man. That tells us about his character and how much love and care and compassion he gave to the local church. In 1 Timothy chapter 4 and verse 12, Paul writes, "Let no one despise your youth, but be an example to believers in word, in conduct, in love, in spirit, in faith, and in purity." And there can be no doubt that having such a large following of people who wanted to follow him wherever he would lead, that he was a man who exemplified that type of character, of leadership, and of example. Then we look in 1 Corinthians chapter 3 and verse 6. 1 Corinthians 3, verse 6, where Paul says, I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the increase. He was a church builder. Paul came in and he started the church there and he preached the message that people listened to. But then Apollos came in on his heels and he built them up. He encouraged. He's not called Barnabas as the great missionary was, who was the son of encouragement, but he has that same spirit about him, that he built up the church. I planted, but Apollos watered. And then God gave the increase. And then 1 Corinthians chapter 16. 1 Corinthians 16 and verse 12. Now concerning our brother Apollos, I strongly urged him to come to you with the brethren, but he was quite unwilling to come at this time. However, he will come when he has a convenient time. You see, Paul wanted Apollos there. Paul had corrected a lot of problems in the Corinthian church throughout this letter. I mean, it is the most stern of all the New Testament letters in dealing with doctrinal integrity, doctrinal problems. And Paul says, I encouraged Apollos to come there. Paul felt that Apollos' presence would have made a profound difference. He was a man who made time for the brethren to encourage, to challenge them, and to help them stay on the right path. You know, all of these things we learn about Apollos, it describes a man of great character. But I think the part of his personality that is most impressive is that second point we made. that he was willing, no matter what it cost, to lay aside pride, to lay aside comfort, his own personal tradition, and be willing to change for the truth. I know a modern day Apollos, and so do you. In fact, he texted me this morning from Corona, California, excited that Manny and Aurora worship there this morning, where Kevin Swiger preaches. And my story with Kevin Swiger started in 1998. As I was preaching in Meridian, Idaho, my dad was preaching in Fresno, California. My Uncle Randy had lung cancer and didn't have very long to live, lived in Kentucky. And my dad wanted to go see his brother one last time, and he found out that there was a seminar by a radio preacher by the name of Alistair Begg. He has a radio program, you may have heard it, who my dad had been listening to this fella for months and months, and he was so impressed at how he would get so close to the truth on some issues, particularly salvation issues, but then he'd pull back a little bit. And so my dad thought, well, if I'm going to be there seeing my brother anyway, I'll just drive up to Ohio and go to this seminar. Maybe I can get some one-on-one time with this Mr. Begg, and we can perhaps talk about some of these things, maybe have an influence. That didn't happen. My daddy didn't get any alone time with Alistair Begg and didn't get to study the Bible with him at all. But his prayers were answered in a different way. Because he sat down, and right next to him sat a young preacher in another group by the name of Kevin Swiger. He had come to this to be encouraged, and he didn't know my daddy. He'd never met him before. He hadn't even heard of the Churches of Christ. And they sat down, and neither one of them knew anybody else, and they got a cup of coffee together and enjoyed this seminar, and then they went and had lunch together because neither one had anybody else to eat lunch with, and they got to talking and conversing about the truth and about the Word of God and about what it means to serve the Lord and what the church should look like and all of the above. And so they exchanged email addresses, and when they both got home, Kevin there in the Cleveland area, my daddy back in California, they started sending correspondence back and forth, and they'd start to talk on the phone. And Kevin was certain he'd be able to straighten out Brother Stan, because Brother Stan, he was such a sincere, good man. He just was a little hung up on this baptism issue. So Kevin started studying with my daddy, and he decided, the best way for me to understand this is to study. So he started teaching in the church where he preached. He started teaching on the subject of baptism, and it was interesting. Kelly, his wife, after several months said, you're sounding a lot like Stan is. And he said, no, I'm not. Well, then they studied a little more, and then he flew out to California to attend a workshop there in the fall of 1998, where I was the young preacher invited to preach on the program. And so my dad introduced us, and then the three of us sat together and studied the subject of baptism and new birth till the wee hours of the morning. And we looked at questions like, what about the thief on the cross? We looked at questions like, what about Cornelius? We looked at questions like, what about Romans chapter 10? And on and on and on. And patiently and lovingly, and it's easy with Kevin, we just had a great conversation and study of the Bible. Kevin didn't seem to my dad or I, he was convinced, but he went home. And he kept teaching his Bible class until he calls in December of that year. And he says, Brother Stan, I don't know if you need to come here or I need to come there, but I need to be baptized into Jesus Christ. He flew to California. He was baptized. That was, I think, on a Thursday or Friday. He flew home. And that next Sunday morning, he stood in his pulpit to the people he loved, and he shared with them the gospel message he'd learned. They stood up. One man stood up before his sermon was over and told him, get out of the pulpit. And they gave him a week to be out of the preacher's parsonage. And so here's a man who, because he learned the truth, was willing to stand up to those who he loved and who wanted to share what he'd learned with, but he knew probably wouldn't receive it very well. And in boldness and fervor, he shared the truth. It cost him his job. It cost him his home. That's the kind of man Apollos was. And he gives us a powerful example of what it means to put the will of God above everything else. Tonight, if you need to put the will of God above anything else in your life, above your opinions or what you prefer or what you don't prefer, or above traditions or anything else that might be standing in the way, don't delay. Put His will first. Have that fervor and never let it go. If you come right now as we stand, as we sing.